Ezra Wild. He had dark blonde hair, and his second toe is longer than his big toe, just like just like his papa's. And when he was born, he looked just like his sister.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a place where moms and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Winter.
And I'm Lee. We are grateful you joined us today. Please note that this is a story of loss and has triggers.
Thanks to our lost parents who are willing to be vulnerable and share their children with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, just know that on our YouTube channel there are pictures and videos that are related to the stories that are being shared.
Subscribe and share it with a friend that might need it, and tell them to subscribe. Why? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they're still a part of us. We are so excited to have Angelica here today to talk about her sweet son, Ezra. Angelica, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about Ezra. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you? Who are you? Where are you from? What do you do? Yeah, and I guess where were you at the time of Ezra's birth?
Thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate you wanting to hear his story. My name is Angelica. I am 32 years old. I live in Idaho, and I'm a registered nurse. uh, I have worked for 8 years, but the last 4 years have been in the neonatal ICU, which has been kind of an especially interesting challenge as
Ye-
of late.
Yes, I am
Um,
sure.
but I was working full time when I was pregnant with him, and um, kind of through COVID too, but nothing really ever changed for me because I was still working in a hospital setting. So
Yeah,
still going in
still going
three
in.
days a week.
Great.
Um,
And what does your family look like? Who you mentioned your Ezra's papa, so
so I had been married for almost 10 years, my husband Nick, and we have a 3.5-year-old little girl named Philippa.
awesome. That's wonderful. And anything you guys like to do in your spare time? Any hobbies as a family or personally?
My husband and I, we met in college in the marching band,
You
and
did?
so yes.
So what, okay, I got to ask, what did you play in the marching band? Because I was in the marching band too.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I played the alto saxophone,
Nice.
and Nick played the trombone.
Wonderful. That is, I have fond memories of the marching band. So I love that you guys met in the marching
Me
band.
too. And I mean, after college, we would play in wind ensembles together, but it kind of dwindled after Philippa was born, and now with COVID, it's not really all that safe to be playing a wind instrument
E-
amongst children.
exactly.
But, um, but that was what we used to do for fun, and then just spending time with our family. We have extended family fairly close. Nick's parents live about 2 minutes away. Mine live about 5 minutes away,
Oh, that's
and
great.
then my brother and sister-in-law live about 2 minutes away as well.
Oh,
So
that's a blessing. I have found to have family nearby.
yes,
So that's
it
wonderful.
really is.
And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but I just wanted to point out that you are a NICU nurse, and that is quite heavy, I'm sure. So I appreciate you coming on because you probably can lend a little bit more of a different perspective for our listeners. So thank you so much for coming on again. So
Thank you so much.
yeah. And when was Ezra born? Can you give us kind of some context? You don't have to give his exact birth date, but can you give us like how long ago was it that he was born?
I was born on June 1st of 2020,
Okay. So it
so
really,
it's been a little over 10 months.
yeah, it's still very new for you. And I'm so sorry that it is so raw still, I'm sure, for you. So tell me, were you planning on getting pregnant with Ezra and any fertility issues, or was that something that was part of your general family plan?
We were really fortunate to not have any fertility issues, but it did take us about 7 months before we found out that he was on the way. So it took a while, and sometimes it can feel like forever when you're trying
Yeah.
and when when you're trying to build your family and you have this timeline in the back of your head and you just realize exactly how little control you have
Yeah.
over it.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. But that's great that you guys found out you were pregnant, and so he was planned, and, how was your pregnancy?
It was actually it was really good until it wasn't.
Yeah.
Um, we found out we were expecting him in November of 2019, and, I just remember being really excited, but also really nervous, kind of anticipating something bad to happen before anything ever did happen, you know? I've just always been a very anxious person, and especially working in the NICU, I know I've seen a lot of things that can go wrong, and so I guess in my head, I'm just trying to anticipate those things all the time, which is not especially good for my mental health, but, I was kind of cautiously optimistic
Okay.
when we found out that we were expecting.
Now, as I'm actually a little curious, how did Philippa's pregnancy go? Were you still cautious because of that?
Yeah, yeah, probably for different reasoning. Oh, somewhat. Uh, so I had just started working in the NICU
Mm,
when we found out about Philippa,
okay.
and before that, I was working in the adult world, and so they put me into all of these kind of orientation type courses with the new grads because working with the neonatal population is very different.
Mhm.
And so I was learning about all of the things that could happen as as I was meeting each of these milestones in my own pregnancy with my daughter. And so I was so worried, just so anxious that something could happen, kind of bracing myself kind of for for something to happen. And nothing did. I just was building up all of this anxiety, and oh gosh, I don't know. It's just the way that my brain works. I guess if there were an Olympic event for worrying, I would have so many gold medals. I wouldn't know what to do with them.
Yeah. I usually am very, as I guess, cautiously optimistic as well, because you just have a few things, you've seen enough things that you're like, something's gonna go bad. uh, yeah. So your pregnancy was good. You guys find out that he was gonna be a boy at the 20-week scan? Is that something
Yes,
you guys wanted to do, is and make sure that you knew?
yeah. Mostly because when it comes to naming our children, we wanted to cut the name pool down by half if we could.
Smart.
So, and it was actually about 17 weeks that we found out that we were having a boy. And we were actually able to bring Philippa with us to that appointment, not because we planned it that way,
Mhm.
but we just couldn't find anybody to take care of her that particular day. So it was the three of us in there, and they didn't plan to do an ultrasound, but did one so that Philippa could see him and hear his heartbeat. And doctor said, "Well, we're still a few weeks early, but would you like to know if it's a boy or a girl?" And he said, "Tentatively, I can tell you you're having a boy." And then 3 weeks later, it was confirmed.
That's great. Oh, that's special that Philippa was able to be there too. That's so fun. That was probably that was probably in the middle of COVID too, wasn't it? When you
It
had that
was
appointment.
before lockdown. It was
Okay.
before lockdown, and at that point, they were still allowing
Oh,
family to come with you to
okay.
your appointments, and they hadn't told us anything about not allowing children, and we just figured that we would keep her at a distance in case she happened to be one of those asymptomatic carriers or something like that, keep her away from the other parents,
Yeah.
and then bring her into the office and keep her on the opposite side of the room from the doctor. But just we were considering what happened, I'm just so grateful that she was there. I know that she would probably won't remember it, but
Yeah. What a blessing. Really. I That is so special for her to have been there. And how were your other appointments? Was there anything at all that was of concern, I guess?
Not really, actually. And I just that was, that was one of the things that made me feel so perplexed about this feeling of impending doom that I constantly had through the pregnancy. About the only thing that was a little bit abnormal was during the 20-week ultrasound when we were taking a look at his heart. There were 3 areas of echogenicity, and I think it was his left atrium. And Philippa had had one in her left atrium as well. And I talked with the doctor about it a little bit, but he said unless there were more spots, more areas of echogenicity that you can see, that he wouldn't recommend a fetal echo.
Okay.
Just that they were small areas of calcification and that he wasn't concerned about it. So I tried to not be concerned about it too. But he was healthy and strong and so active. Um, I remember Philippa, she moved around a lot, but he was he was like a little ninja in there.
That's so great. So super
He was,
active.
yes, extremely active, and his movement was extremely predictable too, which which was something that I was really grateful for
Mhm.
because that gave me a little bit of solace when I would start to worry about something, you know, think to myself, "Oh, I haven't felt a move for a little bit," then he would give me a little jab, and I would know he was okay.
He's like, "I'm hearing you, mom."
Yes.
So, that is going along, just fine, and I guess tell me what happened. What were the series of events that led to you finding out that Ezra was going to be stillborn?
So it was a string of 3 days that I was working, starting from May, oh goodness, I think it was May, 29th, and it had been really busy on the unit, just a lot of acuity, high census, and just a lot of work for all of us to do. And I got to day number 3. So at that point, it was May 31st. I had a really busy assignment and was finally able to slow down and get some lunch, but it was about 3 o'clock at that point, 3 or 3:30. And I remember feeling him move around the time that I was eating lunch. But then I went back to my assignment, and with everything that I was doing, I guess I just wasn't paying attention to see if he was moving anymore or at any point after that. So I finished up my shift and gave report, and I still had so much charting to do. So I sat down and was drinking cold water, expecting him to move, but he wasn't moving. And that set off alarm bells in my head. But I know that I'm an anxious person already. So I thought that I was just overreacting a little bit, that something just didn't feel quite right. I finished charting and left the unit. I was walking to my car and just checking my phone for any messages that I had missed. And my mom had sent me a photograph of my grandmother. And I realized that it had been 12 years since her passing. So she passed on May 31st. And I don't know why, but I felt like that was strangely significant. And I just felt so sad. But, I was still talking to Ezra, still kind of rubbing my belly and walking to my car and telling him that we were gonna go home and see what his sister and papa were doing. Got home and, I remember just thinking to myself that he hadn't moved while I was in the car. I told my husband, and at that point, Philippa was already in bed and asleep. So I think I had given her a kiss on the forehead that morning when I went to work, but I hadn't seen her beyond that. And I was so preoccupied with the fact that he wasn't moving that I didn't go in to kiss her goodnight. So we had dinner and I tried to kind of elicit a little bit of movement. Um, I think I ate an orange, trying to get him to move. I even brought out ice packs and kind of held them on either side of my abdomen to see if I could get him to do anything. And my husband said, "Oh, there, I thought I felt something." And so I took a little bit of a deep breath and I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm just overreacting at this point. And so I took a shower, but I still wasn't feeling that really significant movement that I was accustomed to. And then we started to get ready for bed. And it was a Sunday, my last day of work. I wasn't going into work the following morning, but Nick was. So he started to get settled for work, or settled to bed, you know, prior to my work week. And I stayed up for a little bit and started to count. And I actually pulled out my stethoscope and tried to find him. And I could, usually find him. If I couldn't hear him terribly well, at the very least, I could hear his heartbeat. And even if it sounded distant, it was there.
Mhm.
But I couldn't find him. And I started to panic a little bit. And so about 23 minutes into the kick count, I stopped. And I knew that I was supposed to go for about 2 hours or so, but I thought, I haven't felt anything for at least that long. So I called L&D and asked them what they thought because I wanted to get their opinion and make sure I wasn't going in unnecessarily. They told me to go. It was also very late at that point. It was after midnight. So, at that point, Nick had fallen asleep. So I went and I got dressed, and I even remember looking up and down at the things in my closet, thinking to myself, "Okay, so if something is wrong, if something really awful has happened, what clothing do I not mind hating for the rest of my life?" I woke my husband up and I told him that I was gonna go to the hospital, and he asked me if he wanted me go to have him go with me. And I told him not to because if I was overreacting, I didn't want to wake up the whole family, make them worry for nothing, especially since everybody else had to work too. So I told him to stay with Philippa, and and I left. And I remember leaving with a phone charger that I could have in my hospital room, and my ID and my insurance card and my clothes, and that was it. I didn't even have a hospital bag packed, and honestly, the unpacked hospital bag is still hanging where it was 10 months ago. I haven't been able to touch it. Um,
Angelica, can I ask you a quick question? What
yeah.
what week are you at this time?
Oh, sorry about that. At this point, I am 33 weeks and 5 days
Okay.
gestation.
Okay.
I remember that really distinctly because I remember having read so many stories just with COVID-19 being so unpredictable. I had read a story about a mother who had lost her life at about 33 weeks or so. Um, and because we were about at the same place in our pregnancies, I thought to myself, okay, if I can just get through this week, everything will be okay. If I can get to 34, everything will be okay. And so but I was seriously doubting that things were going to be okay at that point. So I was driving, and I went to the same hospital that I work at,
Mm.
and triage for labor and delivery is right down the hall from the NICU. So I'd been there earlier in the day. I could have gone at any point in the day, and that's all been a really hard thing, actually, knowing that I was there all day long and could have gone over, and that maybe things would have been different. But so I'm driving and I'm talking to him, and I'm driving in silence, just thinking to myself what might be happening, considering what could cause decreased fetal movement in him at that point. trying to determine what was going on, if anything, and how he was going to do, if he was going to be delivered that night, or I guess at that point that morning, because it was really early on, June 1st. And I kept telling him, "It's okay. You're gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay." I arrived to the hospital and I parked the car and I had forgotten a mask. So I entered through the emergency room, which is where they were having everyone enter, and they handed me a mask. And the nurse who was at the front desk asked me if I knew where L&D was, and I told them that I did. And then, seeing me with my giant protruding belly at that point, he looked at me, he said, "Good luck," and sent me upstairs. And I just remember feeling so much dread at that point, so much dread, walking those halls and waiting for the elevator to come up or to come back down, the elevator to come down. Um, so I got checked in to triage and they got me into my room and started to set up the Doppler, but my nurse couldn't find him, couldn't find Ezra anywhere. So she asked me where we normally were able to find him, and so I pointed on my abdomen to where she could go, and still nothing. And she looked at me, she said, "You know what? I'm going to call the doctor and see if the doctor can bring down a machine, an ultrasound machine. That way we can see what's going on." And there's a part of me that knew what was going on when she said that, um, but I didn't want to believe that anything was severely wrong. So I just kind of took a breath and talked to him until the doctor came. I ended up falling asleep a little bit because I hadn't slept at all since about 6 5:45 a.m. the morning before. Um, so I was nodding off, and I thought to myself, "There's no way that I could be falling asleep if something was seriously wrong." I was awoken by the doctor on call coming through. He said, "I am so, so sorry that it took me so long." He said, "I got here as soon as I could, and I even said some prayers on the way down." And there was a part of me that thought, "That is so sweet," but then there was another part of me that thought, "Oh gosh, if you're praying that things are okay, then I guess is that things really aren't." So, he even told me to take my mask off at that point, and I told him, "No, it's okay, I feel fine and comfortable, it's okay." And so he started the ultrasound, taking a look at Ezra, and, the screen's at a little bit of an angle, and there was no movement, and, as he was passing kind of up along his rib cage, I was trying to see if I could find his heartbeat, but I couldn't see anything, and I wasn't hearing anything either. And I thought to myself, "This is not okay. Something is really, really not okay." But then I thought to myself, "You are not trained to do an ultrasound, so just take a minute. Maybe everything's fine." He traced back and forth along my abdomen for a long time. At least it felt like a long time. And then he looked up at me, and his eyes had started to get a little bit glassy. And he said, "I just need to be absolutely sure." And in the back of my brain, I was screaming, "Absolutely sure of what? Absolutely sure of what?" And then he put the wand down and he looked at me and he said, "I am so, so sorry." At that point, nobody, not one of us, had said the words gone or dead or no heartbeat. He didn't need to say anything more for me to know what had happened or to understand what he saw or didn't see. I started to fall apart, and the nurse asked me if there was anyone that I needed for them to call, and I said, "Yes, please, my husband." And at that point, I felt my phone buzz, and I guess he had he had woken up and realized how long I had been gone, and, uh, and asked me if everything was okay. So I called him, and I I was just in tears, struggling to get words out, and I didn't even tell him what had happened. All I asked him was if he could come to the hospital, and I don't know if it was because I genuinely was forgetful, like, just forgot to mention something or didn't wanna say it out loud because that would make it real, and he said, "Yes, yes, I'll be there soon," and he started to call around and try to find someone to be there with Philippa, to stay with her overnight, and so I hung up the phone, and my doctor, he was really kind, and he sat with me for a little bit, but then he had to go, and, it took Nick about 20 minutes to get to the hospital. We live about 15 minutes away, but he struggled to find anybody awake at that point. It was 2 AM, I think, uh, 2:15, but he ended up getting ahold of his dad, and his dad came to stay with our daughter, um, and for that time period, it felt like forever, but for that time period, I just remember rocking back and forth and crying and holding, just like clutching my abdomen, saying, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over again. I didn't know what else to say or what else to do. Um, when Nick arrived, I gave him a big hug, and it wasn't too much longer after that that the doctor came back in with the ultrasound machine. He said, "Guys, I'm so sorry. I'm not trying to torture you here, but this is the doctor, and we wanted to be 100% sure of what I saw, because if I'm wrong, then there's no way that I can forgive myself." So he did another ultrasound, and at that point, Nick knew, and later when I talked to him, he said that I almost didn't need to mention what had happened, to say out loud what had happened, because he knew that something was very wrong, like beyond "we're going to deliver him tonight and he's very sick" wrong. Uh, and so after that second ultrasound, the doctor put down the wand and he said, "I'm so sorry again." And then he told us that he and his wife had experienced a loss like that about a decade before. And he said not to blame ourselves for anything and not to turn the pain and the anger inward, and then said that he would come back in a little bit for us to determine what the next steps were going to be. Um, at that point, uh, Nick, he held my hand and he said, "What are we going to call him?" It's the name, "What are we going to call him?" And he had actually narrowed our names down to Felix and Ezra. And for some reason, the last, you know, the days leading up to that, I had been calling him Ezra, just kind of trying it out, and it felt right. And that was when we named him Ezra, Ezra Wilde, like Oscar Wilde.
Oh, uh-huh.
Um, yeah, because Philippa's middle name is Danger,
I
and
love
so
that so much.
thank you. It was Nick's idea, so we figured we needed to follow the theme. Um, and then Nick looked at me and he said, "Well, at least the hardest part is over." And I looked at him, I said, "No, the hardest part is not over." For as awful as it is to be told that your child is dead, now we have to deliver him. Uh, the doctor came in and talked to me a little bit about it. We had a scheduled C-section that we had actually made at 8 weeks, which I thought was way too early for them to be putting me on the OR schedule. Um, just just nursing superstition, I guess.
Mm.
Very much akin to that feeling that you get when somebody says the word quiet on the floor,
Yes.
you know?
Mhm.
And but he was a scheduled C-section, repeat C-section, because I'd had a C-section with my daughter and been diagnosed with cephalopelvic disproportion. I just was not built to have a vaginal delivery. And so instead of attempting a VBAC, I said, just go ahead and put us on the schedule whenever. And I didn't even, I was fine with not waiting until my doctor, my attending, actually came on duty himself. The anesthetist came and chatted with us too, and he was surprisingly cheery, which I thought would be bothersome, but it really wasn't. It's almost kind of helpful.
Yeah.
Uh, and and then I fell asleep, and I woke up a few hours later when they came in to prep me for surgery. They had put me on the schedule for about 6:30 or so, and I remember waking up, and then all of a sudden I felt cramps and, just kind of the beginning of contractions, I thought anyway. And I started to feel really sick to my stomach, just really, really nauseated. And they'd already prepped me, uh, and so they wheeled me out and said, "Don't worry, we'll get something in your system." They started an IV. They drew a lot of blood, um, for testing on me to determine what had happened. And they wheeled me into the OR and put me onto the table and told me that I was going to have a spinal block. So they kind of sat me up, and Nick was getting ready into hospital scrubs. And they told me to sit up, and I did. And when I did, I looked off into the corner where my heart chart was sitting, and there was a giant butterfly pasted on the front of it. And then I just fell apart because that made it that much more real. And then at the same time, I was thinking about the fact that before my husband even knew the true nature of what had happened, my coworkers probably knew because they probably saw a 33-weeker come into triage. We're anticipating potentially getting said 33-weeker, and then the status went from, you know, from absent fetal movement to fetal demise. It just all of it just was too much. It was just way too much. They pulled up the drape and started the surgery. And shortly before that, my husband had come in and he was sitting at my side. And I mean, neither of us really were in a great headspace. We just, we were both in such a state of shock. For Philippa's birth, Nick brought in his phone and he was taking pictures as they were doing the surgery. This time around, he forgot his phone. And so the only photo that we have in the OR is the one that the anesthetist took for us with his phone. And so I'm just laying there and just crying, and the OR is silent, just painfully silent. Later, someone asked me, "Oh, which NICU team came to attend your C-section?" Because that's just standard protocol in the NICU. You attend every C-section. And I had to look at them and say, nobody was there. Nobody attended my C-section, because why would a NICU team be there for a baby who's dead? I felt a lot of pressure, and then I felt no pressure at all, just emptiness. And that was when I knew that he had been born because I could just tell he was gone. I just, tell that he was not physically there anymore. So no one had to tell me that he had been born, but I could hear a nurse begin to cry. And she said, "Oh, he's so beautiful." And she brought him over to the warmer and laid him down on a swaddle blanket that had chucks over top of it. And she began to swaddle him up. And my husband went over to the warmer and took a look at him and said, "He looks just like Pippa. He looks just like her." And that just, if I had started to get any sense of calm, it was shattered at that point, and I just started to sob again. And the nurse handed Ezra to my husband and brought him over and put his cheek against mine. And if I didn't know any better, for as warm as his cheek was, I would have thought that he was still alive. Um, he was born at 6:42 a.m. on June 1st. Um, Not too long after that, my attending physician came in and looked at me. He said, "I'm so, so sorry." You know, he just kind of ducked into the aisle. He said, "So I'm so, so sorry. We'll figure out what happened. We're going to figure out what happened." And he gave my shoulder a squeeze and he left. They took Nick into the recovery room before they had finished closing on me. And and it wasn't very long before they dropped the drape, and I could tell that the obstetrician who was working on me, he was the same doctor who told us that Ezra was gone. That he'd been crying the entire time. His eyes were beet red. Um, and I asked him what happened. And he said, "I'm not sure." He said, "The assessment looks perfect. He looks perfect. Um, there's nothing wrong with the umbilical cord. Nothing that I could see. Um, I'm not even sure that you'll want to have the placenta tested because I just don't see anything wrong. I don't see anything wrong. I'm not sure what happened." You know, um, and so once they were done, they wheeled me out and they took me onto labor and delivery. I thought that maybe they were going to take me onto a different floor or something away from other laboring moms and living babies, but I was wheeled into room 10. I can remember, and I remember going in there thinking to myself, the last time I was in the room, we were here for a code for another baby. Just, the awful things that you remember having worked in the same hospital. And when I got in there, Nick was cradling Ezra, and they got my bed situated. They helped me to sit up a little bit. Nick looked at me and said that he had heard another baby being born a few minutes ago, while they were kind of showing him into the room. And then I started to cry again. And he said, "No, no, it's okay. I'm just so grateful that their baby's okay." We got to rock him and talk to him and sing to him. Our family, we weren't sure because of the pandemic if our family was going to be able to come and see him, but we talked with our nurse and she talked to her charge and the charge talked to the house supervisor and they're like, "No, we're going to get people in here for you. Just give us a list of names." And so they allowed my parents and Nick's parents and my brother and sister-in-law to come up. Nick has a sister and a half brother, but both of them live upstate. So, and then he looked at me and he said, "Well, wait a minute, what about Philippa?" And I said, "No, no, I would have loved her to be there, for her to have been there. I would have loved that. But at the same time, I didn't imagine that they would be too keen on the idea of having a 2-year-old in my hospital room. And so slowly our family members started to kind of trickle in, all of them just as red-eyed and um, perplexed as we were. Our nurse got a bunch of footprints. She got sets of footprints for all four couples. So my husband and I, his parents, my brother and sister-in-law. And they told us that we could have two visitors at a time. And so they came in couples, and it started with my parents. And they went to leave. And my nurse came in. She said, "Oh, wait a second, weren't your parents going to stay for longer?" And I said, "No, we're only supposed to have two sets of parents, two visitors in at any one given point in time." She's like, "No, forget about that. You can have all of them in here if you want. We don't care." And so we called them back up, and all the grandparents were there with him at the same time. And eventually, when everybody had had a chance to say hello and goodbye, they all left. And it was just the three of us. Um, I asked Nick if he wanted to call one of our family members and show Philippa her baby brother, and he said that he wasn't sure that he could handle that, you know, and he wasn't sure that she would really understand what was going on anyway. I kind of regret at this point not at least asking if we could have her come up, even for a couple minutes, or not not maybe being more insistent on having somebody call us and show Ezra to Philip. But I remember holding him. At that point, he was swaddled, but he was swaddled with his arms straight down. And I wanted to see his hands. So I unswaddled him a little bit and brought his arms up. And I remember saying out loud, "He should have been swaddled with his hands close to his face because that's what's developmentally appropriate." And then I realized how ridiculous that sounded. Um, and I just held him, and I remember holding his hands and staring into his face. And we kind of looked at his hair, and Nick said, "His hair is so dark." And I said, "No, it's not. He just hasn't been washed yet." And so we kind of dusted up, ruffled his hair a little bit. And I said, "No, look at his hair. It's blonde. It's dark blonde." And for anyone who maybe isn't looking at a picture of me at this point, I am not I'm not blonde hair, blue eyed. I I have relatively dark skin, hair, eyes, and so the fact that either of my children have blonde hair is I have no idea where those genes come from. But I just looked him up and down and was just so amazed and so in love with him. And he weighed 4 pounds 15 ounces, which is a pretty decent size for a 33-weeker. I was worried that maybe he wasn't getting enough or something. No, he was getting enough. We were able to hold him for almost 9 hours, and that they would have let us keep him for longer, I think. But at that point, we noticed that his skin started to shear a little bit in different places, and it was just getting progressively worse as time passed. And so, and at that point, I mean, I didn't even think to ask someone to bring clothing for him because I didn't have a going home outfit for him or anything like that. I had nothing prepared for him. So he wasn't clothed, and we didn't bathe him because I had just been through surgery and I couldn't really move very well. And I was just so worried about damaging his skin that much more. So I didn't want them to bathe him because even though I know it wouldn't hurt him, it would break my heart to continue to injure his skin. Um, that we sang to him, and I gave him a bunch of kisses and I handed them over to Nick. And I said, "Here, you hold him last." And he said, "No, no, you should be able to hold him until he goes." And I said, "I had 33 weeks with him. I got a chance to feel him move. I think that you deserve to hold him for as long as we have him." When the time came, we handed him over to our nurse, and then that was that. They, they gave me a weighted bear afterward, which I proceeded to sleep with for about 6 months straight. And I ended up staying in the hospital for another 2 days, I think, yeah. The following morning, I remember my doctor, my own personal obstetrician, coming in. He said, "Hey, you look like you're feeling okay. Do you want to go home today?" And I just thought to myself, "No, there's no way I can go home just yet. Not yet. Not to silence." So I ended up staying for 2 nights and going home on Wednesday morning. Um, and they ended up putting me in antepartum so that I didn't have to be up on newborn where you could hear babies cry. Um, and that's his birth story.
I'm so I thanks for sharing that. I I'm so glad that you got some time with him and that your your hospital um was willing to kind of get your parents in there, and your brother and sister-in-law. That just made me happy to hear that because I've heard so many stories that people have not had that chance, and it's so sad.
It's absolutely heart-wrenching. This pandemic has made that process so much harder than it already is to begin with.
Yeah. Um, you guys gave them Ezra, and he stayed in the hospital for a couple more days. Did you guys end up deciding to have a funeral, or was he cremated, or what did you guys decide to do with him?
I actually grew up um, alongside an undeveloped portion of land belonging to a cemetery, and it's the house that my parents still live in. So we we decided to have him buried there. Um, and I've had a couple of coworkers, three of them, who have lost babies,
Really?
and yes, yeah, and their babies are buried in the same cemetery. Most recently, a friend of mine, she lost her little girl. She was about a month old or so, and she'd been in the NICU. She was very tiny, very premature, but she had passed away, and I remembered where she had buried her little girl. And so, it was actually when I was still in the hospital that my husband and my father-in-law, because my father-in-law and my mother-in-law offered to pay everything for everything that the funeral home didn't cover, for everything that the cemetery didn't cover. They offered to pay for everything, and, and they went over and were looking for a plot, and, so I told my husband to look for my friend's little girl, and, it turns out that the plot right next to her was vacant, so they're buried side by side.
That's so nice.
We didn't get to have a funeral per se. We were raised Catholic, but at that point, having a mass for him was completely out of the question. which I completely understood, and that was okay. So we had a graveside committal. The priest came and he did a blessing over Ezra's grave, and we only had a small group of people there, including my friend
Oh,
whose little girl's buried next to my son. Um, we had a very small group of people, and all of us were spread out because of the, the pandemic and trying to keep the cemetery's staff safe in the process. Um, and then after that, I mean, I feel bad because I feel like there are so many things that I could have done but didn't, because in the moment I just wasn't thinking about it. I was just in shock that this was happening. You know, I always knew that it could happen. I always knew that there was a possibility that something like this could happen. But regardless of how much I thought I understood about child loss prior to this as a nurse, I knew nothing. I knew nothing. What I understood barely scratches the surface. So, in that moment, we didn't play any music or anything like that. Um, One of my other friends, super sweet, and she brought a couple of pinwheels for him. And we knew that eventually the pinwheel would be taken away because the cemetery cleans everything up periodically. So we buried one of them actually in there with him.
oh, you did?
There was a pinwheel on top of his casket. Um, and then my husband, he quoted. I don't know if you've ever seen A Muppet Christmas Carol.
Yes, we love that movie.
It's the scene after they find out that Tiny Tim has died, and but he said, "In this life, there are meetings and partings. That is the way of it. We will never forget Ezra and the love that he brought into our lives." It was something along the lines of that, but I very distinctly remember the reference to A Muppet Christmas Carol. Um, and, uh, and then that was it. There was a small gathering that my mother and father-in-law had at their house. My brother and sister-in-law came from Washington, and they cooked everything. Made sure that we didn't have to do anything, and he just had a small gathering with everybody who was able to go to the service, and and it was wonderful in a very melancholy kind of way.
Yeah, that I'm so glad that that was you were able to have some be with family too and friends, it sounds like.
We were very fortunate.
Yeah. Angelica, I know that your OB and also said that he was going to try and find out as much as possible of what happened. Did you guys end up having an autopsy done? It sounds like you got blood also taken. Were they able to find anything, or was there anything conclusive about what happened to Ezra?
No, unfortunately, um, we ended up so they ended up drawing blood on me to determine if there was some kind of a clotting issue, and everything came back normal for me. They wanted to do a cytogenetic microarray to determine if there was anything genetically that would have caused his stillbirth, and that was all completely normal as well. Uh, Originally, we thought that they were going to have to do the cytogenetic microarray on his own tissue. So, kind of maybe a tendon or something from the back of
Mm.
from his ankle.
Mhm, mhm.
But they were able to do it on the placenta, and that came back normal. They did offer to do an autopsy, and I wanted to know what happened. So I was leaning toward yes, but my husband Nick didn't even pause. He just said, "No, no, we're not doing that." And the same thing with cremation. He said, "No, I can't envision us doing that to him." He said, "I know that he's gone and I know that he doesn't hurt anymore, but I can't do that to him." So, at this point, we don't know why, and I don't think we ever really will.
Yeah.
Um, I later asked I later asked the OB who delivered him if, under the same circumstances, he would have had an autopsy done, and he said, "As a doctor who's done autopsies on infants, I don't think I would have, because I don't think that there would have been anything of note to find just based on his physical assessment." He said he was perfect. There was nothing to indicate that there was an infectious process, and the blood work showed that as well. He said, I don't know that we'll have any answers. I don't think we'll have any answers. But under the same circumstances, no, I would not have done an autopsy on my child. So it's still just kind of up in the air.
Yeah. It is kind of nice to hear, and to hear somebody say he looked perfect, and like he said, all intents and purposes, perfect. Angelica, thank you so much for sharing your story. Never ceases to surprise me how much I cry on this podcast, even though I'm very familiar with some of these stories already. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing Ezra with us.
Thank you for allowing me to share him.